Okay, hello everybody. Thanks a lot for joining. So this is the booth on knowledge brokering by UNSSC and more specifically the Knowledge Center for Sustainable Development. So let me start right now, just first of all with who we actually are. We are the United Nations System Staff College, and as the name says, we are the organization of the UN system that deals with learning, training, and knowledge management for UN staff first and foremost, but also for other stakeholders. We've been created a good 20 years ago, and have since then rolled out a number of formats for UN staff and partners, and especially with the adoption of the 2030 agenda a good 6 years ago already, we created the Knowledge Center for Sustainable Development in Bonn, Germany, which is specifically looking at the learning and training needs of UN staff and partners around the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And it essentially aims at equipping UN staff and partners with not just the knowledge, but also the competencies required to address the agenda. Now, what do we do at UNSSC and specifically at the Knowledge Center? As I said, it's about learning, training, and knowledge management. And specifically really looking at the wider transformation that is required. And when we say transformation, what we really mean is a deliberate departure from business as usual. What that means is essentially looking at development more holistically and looking at the connections between the different dimensions of sustainable development, between the goals and the targets. And this is a quote from the introduction to the GSDR. And the GSDR is the Global Sustainable Development Report, which you may know is the report that is being produced every 4 years to really look at learning from the current practices in implementing the 2030 Agenda. And the last GSDR was published in 2019. And for us is really a lighthouse in terms of the ideas that we are putting forward in the Knowledge Center. And one of the key ideas is essentially to say it's not about implementing the 17 goals separately, but it's about exploring ways to achieve increased coherence. It's exploring the linkages, it's exploring ways to find entry points for transformation that would increase synergies. So for us to do that, again, the GSDR is also saying that with this realization that the 2030 Agenda is really not just about the separate goals, but it's about finding these connections, it gives a mandate to all actors, including multilateral institutions, to devote specific attention to this idea of entry points for transformation. And the Global Sustainable Development Report looks at 6 specific entry points that look at ways to realize co-benefits and resolve trade-offs with regards to the Sustainable Development Goals. And this is really what we're trying to do with our learning and training offerings, and finding spaces not just to teach about what the linkages are, but really provide a space for knowledge exchange. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. So what we're trying to do is address what the issues are and how they can be addressed. I'll just give you a few examples around, conveying key insights and competencies, but also fostering peer learning. Because if there's one thing that we have learned, and that is also at the core of the roadmap for education on sustainable development, is that this is not about recipes. It's not about specific models or technologies or tools that you can simply take and apply. It's really about learning from experience, learning from concrete practice, and understanding how to better take into account those interconnections, which also means that it's about strengthening knowledge and practice networks. It's about finding the right person who can relate to the specific challenge one has when it occurs. And for that, some of the topics that we teach about in the Knowledge Center relate to this issue of global megatrends and planetary boundaries. So this wider question of what are some of the wider developments that will affect whether or not we will be able to achieve progress across SDGs. Also the issue of policy coherence for sustainable development. What are the questions we need to ask if we want to look at issues more holistically? The issue of systems thinking. How can we understand the different levers? How can we understand feedback loops? How can we identify entry points for transformation? Circular economy and the whole issue of economic transformation are part of the topics we are addressing, again, to see how do we create a safe and just space for humanity. Again, in the discussion about education for sustainable development, it's quite common sense not to prioritize economic development as the main motor. But what does that mean for economic transformation? What kind of economic policies and practices should we be promoting? What examples can we see that essentially allow to achieve well-being for all within planetary boundaries? This also includes the issue of the Anthropocene and the fact that that humanity is really shaping, is having the biggest effect on planetary boundaries. And again, looking at how we can use the framework on climate change as a development agenda. How can climate action accelerate progress towards the SDGs, but also what are the potential trade-offs in terms of climate adaptation and mitigation that we need to be aware of. Issues such as health in all policies. And again, this is of course a topic that with the pandemic is probably very much in everybody's mind. How do we address a primarily health-related issue in such a way that we do not ignore the effects it has in the social and in the economic sphere, but also how do we achieve better health outcomes by looking at environmental policies, social policies, and economic policies, and also issues such as social protection, which again is a cross-cutting issue that will have a potential synergistic effect across all dimensions of the Sustainable Development Goals. So these are just some examples of the kinds of topics that we're covering in the Knowledge Center. Now, beyond the topics, there is always a dimension of what are the behaviors that are required to advance them? What are the kinds of partnerships that are required to advance them? How do we go about bringing on board the capacities and resources that are required if we want to advance in these areas? And for that, we also specifically look at the issue of leadership for sustainable development. What kind of behaviors, what kind of leadership attitudes are necessary? How do we foster a culture of inclusive and distributive leadership? Moving away from the idea of the single hero who knows everything and brings and sort of runs ahead of everyone. The issue of emotional resilience. How do you as an individual position yourself in this complex environment and find also individual resources and ways to motivate those you're working with? But also the bigger issue of transformative partnerships and collaboration and multi-stakeholder engagement. So how do we identify who needs to be on board, which are the capacities and the resources that are required to advance, which again brings us to the question of who has what interest and what influence on the issue at stake. So again, realizing that political will is not a black box, is not something that you ignore and you apply your technical tool to make a difference, but to really fully read a situation, analyze it, and look at what is the issue, who is holding, who has which interest, who is holding people back, what needs to happen for positive change to occur, and what kind of alliances need to be put in place, what can be done to move those who might be able to influence the situation but do not have sufficient interest to come on board, or those who do have a big interest in blocking progress on the particular issue to limit them in their power. the question of how we actually identify what is at stake and what can be done about it. So we have courses and approaches on the theory of change, looking at the bigger, the deeper issues, the underlying causes, the root causes of an issue, and then turning that reflection on its head, looking at potential solution paths that would allow us to address the specific issues we've identified, but also seeing again the bigger picture of who else needs to be on board for us to make a difference. And lastly, the issue of strategic communication and advocacy, which is in a multi-stakeholder environment, a crucial ability to reach out to those who need to be on board, to communicate what difference you ultimately want to make, and to speak to different counterparts, also speak to the media and advocate for the issues at stake. Overall, I think this shows that, again, and since we are focusing mostly on UN audiences, but certainly not only, we are increasingly working with civil servants, increasingly working with representatives from civil society, the private sector, that it's on the one hand about the what, what are the issues, what do you need to know, but also the how. How do you need to go about it, and how do you make sense out of this complexity? We're moving away from the idea of recipes, from the idea of tools, and of course, tools and recipes might still exist, but you need to contextualize them. You need to learn from how it has played out in other cases, in other contexts. So what we do, and this, some of you might recognize, this is actually taken from the framework for education for sustainable development, which looks at 3 dimensions of learning. And this is very much at the core of our approaches as well. So we typically call this the know, feel, and do approach. So we look at what people need to know about an issue. There is a cognitive learning dimension, understand the sustainability challenges and their complex interlinkages, explore disruptive ideas and alternative solutions. Then you have the dimension of feel. How do you want people to feel about the issue? Because if you don't have an emotional connection, you might not do anything about it. It's good to know about an issue, but if you don't have the personal drive to make a difference, it will not make any difference. So the question is the social and emotional learning dimension. How do you build core values and attitudes for sustainability? How do you cultivate empathy and compassion for other people and the planet? And how do you motivate people to lead the change? And leading the change doesn't mean that it's necessarily decision makers, but anybody at every level. How can we contribute to a society where people at every level are ready to take their responsibility and make a difference? Lastly, the dimension of action. What do we want people to do as a result of the training that we've dispensed? So what is the behavioral learning dimension? What kind of practical action would we want them to take for sustainable transformations in the personal, societal, and political spheres? And of course, always looking at, if we are working with people from the UN system, what does it mean for the role the UN system plays in supporting governments, in supporting countries in their transformative path? If we're speaking with people from civil society, what does it mean in their respective capacities? And the same for the private sector. So those are the 3 core questions, I would say, that guide us every time we prepare a learning opportunity, to really say, what would we like people to know, feel, and do differently as a result of the training that we have dispensed? And saying training, it doesn't have to be a training. It could be another kind of learning solution. And in fact, what we have learned, just before I go into what we have learned, let me just quickly recap the 5 education for sustainable development priority action areas, which you may be familiar with and which are sort of one of the cornerstones of the roadmap on ESD. Is the idea that education for sustainable development needs to be integrated in education policies across the board, that it requires a whole of institution approach. It's not something that you do in a separate corner, but it has to transpire in the entire curriculum. It also has to do with building educator capacity. In fact, one thing we do a lot is run train the trainer formats, both online and face-to-face, because we realize that these kinds of ideas are also not necessarily a given in the community of educators and trainers. Recognize young people as key actors and also look at local action, community level action. Now, this was just an insert to remind us what the ESG framework foresees in terms of priority actions. Now, in terms of lessons that we've learned, and I just said a moment ago, it doesn't have to be a training. First of all, one thing we have learned is that we really need to invest in multipliers and support structures. I just mentioned that we do TOTs, train the trainer formats. We also focus on decision makers and leaders. We work with UN resident coordinator officers. We work with UN country teams, but we also work with schools of public administration because it has become increasingly clear that the role of civil servants is crucial in crafting the change that we want to see, and with decision makers overall in the public and the private sector. What we have seen, and I've said this a couple of times now, is that there are no recipes, that it's really about learning from evidence and examples, which means that we need to invest a lot more time in case studies and scenarios. So it's a lot less about here is the lesson, here is the theory. Of course, this is part of it, but also how has this played out in a particular case? What can be learned? Why has it not worked? Also learning from failure. We've also learned that transformation really requires unlearning and innovation. And that is not always easy when you work with leaders or senior representatives, because a lot of times, of course, when you reach a certain level in your career, you want to feel that you actually have learned enough and it's your role to now multiply and disseminate. And it's quite tricky to say, look, we really have to think about disruptive ways of doing things. I like to say that, and it doesn't come from me, that the light bulb was not invented by improving the candle. And that's a little bit what we're trying to do, to say, can we think about this differently? So run formats about innovation. UNSSC has also played a key role in the development of the innovation toolkit, which some of you might be familiar with, and looking at transformative approaches, looking at ways to include empathy in the way we do training, ways to include design thinking, looking at who the end user or the beneficiary of a program really is and what would really make a difference for them. Transformation requires new partnerships and encounters. So again, not just dispensing a training to one group of people, but really helping different groups of people to open up to others. Multi-sectoral action, multi-stakeholder engagement, as we said before, and creating networks of practice, and ideally issue-based networks of practice, which is again something where we realize it's not just about dispensing an individual training, but it's about maintaining a space for discussion that also allows people to come back to each other after whatever the learning solution was, but to help people connect and find the information when they need it. What we've also learned is that the political economy is a key dimension of development intervention. I said that before in terms of the issues that we need to consider when we try to understand what blocks progress on particular issues. Very often it has to do with the issue of influence and interests. We have to read the environment. We cannot leave this just as a black box. So this is something we have increasingly learned, that it has to be part also of a deliberate approach to addressing development challenges. And also that every country is a developing country. No country, and this is again a sentence from the Global Sustainable Development Report, no country is currently convincingly able to provide for its population or to ensure well-being for all within planetary boundaries. Yes, there are countries that do quite well from the perspective of GDP, even from the perspective of the Human Development Index. But when you look at the countries who do particularly well on the Human Development Index, they are all overshooting on planetary boundaries, regardless of how you measure that. When you look at countries that remain within planetary boundaries, these are typically countries with a rather low Human Development Index. So we actually have no country in the world at this point that is showing us the way to say, how can you distribute the wealth in such a way and manage society in such a way that there is well-being for all without overshooting on planetary boundaries. And this also means that we really need to look at spillovers. You know, initial rankings on SDG have very much looked at who is doing well on SDGs. We have different kinds of rankings, and it's typically the same, mostly European countries ranking rather high on the SDG index. And since this year, the SDG index has introduced this notion of a spillover index, which actually looks at, can we also see to what extent these very same countries are having a negative effect on the ability of other countries to progress on SDGs, depending on the imports, depending on the consequences that, you know, waste management has, imports have, etc. So again, applying a holistic lens and transmitting this idea of a holistic approach in all the learning opportunities that we create. With this, and I'm almost coming to the end, what we have also learned, if we go back more down to earth in terms of the formats, you know, we have always been working online. We have had many face-to-face formats, and like many of you, we've had to move online with many of our formats. But one thing that we've learned is don't design an online training as a face-to-face replacement. An online training exists in its own right, and it needs to be thought through afresh, like a face-to-face meeting would be thought through. What is the objective? What is the learning need? What are the means at our disposal? How can we best cater to that? But not to say, okay, here is what we would have done face-to-face. Let's try to see how we can replace it online, because that is definitely a recipe for disaster. What we've also learned is, you know, while some of our initial online offerings were designed more as a second best option, since unfortunately face-to-face couldn't happen, there are also a lot of advantages in the online learning solutions. They can increase the reach. They can bring together people that would otherwise never have been able to join face-to-face. And they can foster equality. And I put can because they don't necessarily do it. Depends, of course, how you put it together. But the very fact that you have these equal Zoom or whatever platform you use windows in itself already can provide an opportunity for people to engage and discuss that's different from the dynamics that you would typically have in a face-to-face meeting. What we've also learned, and that is the part that is quite tricky in an online environment, is that the kind of learning about transformation really requires experiential learning. It requires exposure, challenges, exchanges, and a safe space for exchange. This is not always easy to put in place online. I think there as well we've learned a lot in terms of how we can create trust online, and that yes, you can create trust online. We weren't necessarily always so sure about that, but really trying to increase exposure, give people an opportunity to speak, to share, to connect, because ultimately the learning in terms of the way forward resides as much in this ability to share and to learn in a contextualized manner than it does from being exposed to the basic concepts and core knowledge. Let me stop here and see if there are any questions, and looking also at my colleagues Pauline and Maximiliano to see if there are any questions. We only have very few minutes left. Let me see if there is anything. I can only see the Zoom chat at this point. I guess there would be potentially questions on YouTube as well. I cannot judge that. Anyone? For those who are in the Zoom meeting, you can, of course, also simply unmute yourselves and ask questions. That would be just as fine. Well, if not, then let me just say thank you very much. This is it from me at this stage, and I would say let's stop it here. We're just a tiny little bit ahead of time. Let's see if there is any question coming now. One thing, Kadi, go ahead. Would you like to unmute yourself? What needs to be unlearned most often? Good question. I guess what needs to be unlearned most often, or what needs to be unlearned often, one thing I think it has to do with hierarchy. We really realize, especially if we look at the United Nations or at the public service, you know, there is a tendency to think in terms of ranks and positions, and with these kinds of challenges, to really co-create, to really collaborate, to really look at ways to bring in knowledge from every member of a team or every member of an office is certainly something that can be challenging. And also that, on the other hand, leadership resides with every single individual. It's also the other way around, you know, don't wait for the supposed leader to take the charge and to give the solution, but designing as a team, co-creating as a team. The other thing that I think needs to be unlearned very often, two things I would say. One is this very notion of transformation. You know, what does it really mean to question what you've learned? And I think when I was speaking about economic transformation before, one person we refer to often is Kate Raworth, who wrote about the donut economy. And one thing she starts her book with is that how difficult it is that when myriads of economy students had to learn certain concepts, to realize that even though so many people learned about them, this idea of eternal growth, this idea that economic growth is the big motor, needs to be unlearned, because economic growth is not necessarily the motor of all, and eternal growth is not realistic in a finite world. So that's probably another important one that needs to be unlearned. Anything else? If not, I think we are essentially at the end. I would be very happy if you follow up with us also by email or leaving a comment in the booth if you are in the conference, and otherwise you can always find us at UNSSC on Twitter or on the UNSSC LinkedIn page, and I'd be happy to connect and ready at your disposal. Thank you very much. I see we have another visitor, Shamal. Great to see you.
Nice, nice to see you too. That's the reason I logged in.
Fantastic. Yeah, you're just coming in at the very end of our broadcast, but I guess that once we stop the broadcast, we'll be happy to still hang around at our booth for a moment, but wonderful to have you. Yeah.